Jake Morrison had always considered himself completely ordinary. At 32, he worked construction in downtown Chicago, lived alone in a small apartment, and spent his weekends watching old movies and fixing things around his building. The only thing remotely interesting about him, in his opinion, was the strange scar that ran along his left shoulder blade, a jagged mark he'd carried since childhood that his adoptive parents claimed came from falling off playground equipment when he was 5. On the Tuesday that changed everything, Jake was working 40 stories up on the new Millennium Tower when the sky began to shimmer. At first, he thought it was heat distortion from the welding work nearby. But then the air itself seemed to ripple, like looking through water, and a shadow fell across the construction site despite the cloudless afternoon sky. "Hey, Morrison," shouted his foreman, Tony Castellanos. "You see that?" Jake looked up from the steel beam he was securing and felt his stomach drop. Hanging in the sky above them, maybe 200 feet up, was something that definitely wasn't a helicopter or airplane. The craft was massive, easily the size of a city block, with a hull that seemed to shift between silver and deep blue depending on how the light hit it. No wings, no visible propulsion, just hanging there as silently as a cloud. The other workers had stopped what they were doing and were pointing and shouting. Someone was already pulling out their phone to record, but Jake noticed the screen was just showing static. In fact, all the electronic equipment on the site, radios, phones, even the digital displays on the cranes, had gone dead. "What the hell is that thing?" Tony muttered, his usual confidence replaced by something Jake had never heard in his voice before: fear. Before Jake could answer, the air around him began to glow. A soft, blue-white light surrounded his body, and suddenly, his feet weren't touching the steel beam anymore. He was floating, rising up toward the impossible craft above them. He tried to shout, tried to grab onto something, anything, but his limbs wouldn't obey him. The paralysis was complete, but somehow not uncomfortable, more like being held gently but firmly by invisible hands. As he rose higher, Jake could see Tony and the other workers becoming smaller below him. They were all looking up, some pointing, others running. A few were trying their phones again, shaking them as if that would make them work. The city spread out beneath him like a map, and for a moment, despite his terror, Jake was struck by how beautiful it looked from up here. Then, he was passing through what felt like a soap bubble. The sensation was strange, like walking through a waterfall that left him completely dry. Beyond it was a corridor that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The walls seemed to bend and curve in ways that his brain insisted were impossible, lit by the same soft blue-white glow that had lifted him from the construction site. The paralysis ended as soon as his feet touched the floor inside the ship. Jake stumbled, caught himself against what might have been a wall, and immediately wished he hadn't. The surface was warm and slightly soft, like touching living skin. He jerked his hand away and looked around desperately for any sign of where he was or how to get out. The corridor stretched in both directions, curving away so that he couldn't see where either end led. The walls, floor, and ceiling all had that same organic quality, as if the entire ship had been grown rather than built. There were no visible seams, no panels or hatches, just smooth surfaces that pulsed very faintly with bioluminescent patterns. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice echoing strangely in the space. The sound seemed to get absorbed by the walls rather than bouncing back normally. "Is anyone there? I don't know how I got here, but I need to get back to the construction site." As if responding to his voice, a section of the wall in front of him began to iris open like a flower blooming in fast forward. Beyond it was another corridor, this one wider and brighter, with what looked like symbols or writing flowing along the walls in streams of light. Jake hesitated. Every instinct told him not to go deeper into this place, to find a way back to the opening he'd come through. But when he turned around, the corridor behind him had sealed itself shut. The wall looked exactly like every other section, no sign there had ever been an opening there at all. With no other choice, he walked through the iris doorway. It closed behind him immediately, trapping him in the new corridor. The symbols on the walls were definitely some kind of writing. He realized though they looked nothing like any language he'd ever seen. They flowed and shifted as he watched, sometimes clustering together, sometimes spreading apart, always moving in patterns that seemed almost alive. The corridor led to a vast circular chamber that took Jake's breath away. The ceiling arched high overhead, maybe 100 feet up, and was completely transparent. Through it, Jake could see the Earth hanging in space like a blue marble, the construction site he'd been working on now invisible beneath the curve of the planet. "We're in space," he whispered to himself, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "I'm actually in space." The chamber itself was filled with beings that were clearly not human, though they were humanoid enough that Jake's first reaction wasn't complete panic. They stood roughly 7 feet tall with elongated limbs and faces that were beautiful in an alien way. Their skin had a faint luminescence to it, shifting between pale blue and silver, and their eyes were large and dark without any visible pupils. There were maybe 20 of them arranged in a rough circle around the center of the chamber, where a raised platform held what could only be described as a throne. It was made of the same organic material as the rest of the ship, but it curved and flowed in elegant patterns that seemed to shift when Jake wasn't looking directly at them. Sitting on the throne was clearly their leader. She, and Jake was somehow certain it was a she, despite the alien features, was taller than the others and carried herself with unmistakable authority. Her skin had more of the silver tones than blue, and she wore something that might have been clothing or might have been part of her body, flowing, gossamer-like material that moved as if it were alive. But it was her eyes that caught Jake's attention. They were the same large, dark orbs as the others, but when they fixed on him, he felt as if she were looking not just at him, but through him, seeing things about himself that even he didn't know. She stood as he entered the chamber, and the other aliens immediately bowed their heads in deference. When she spoke, her voice was like music, but Jake realized with shock that he could understand her words perfectly. "Welcome, human," she said, the words somehow translating themselves in his mind, even though he could hear that she wasn't speaking English. "I am Queen HFY of the Ethereal Dominion. You have been brought before us for evaluation." Evaluation? Jake found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Look, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm just a construction worker. I don't know anything about whatever this is. I just want to go home." Queen HFY stepped down from her throne, moving with fluid grace that reminded Jake of a dancer. As she approached him, the other aliens maintained their bowed positions, but Jake could feel their attention focused on this interaction. "Mistake?" she said, and there was something almost amused in her musical voice. "Human, do you know how many of your species we have observed? Studied? Your kind is interesting in its primitiveness, but hardly unique. What made us select you specifically?" She was close enough now that Jake could see his reflection in her dark eyes. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I really don't know why you'd want me specifically." "Show me your back," she commanded. "My what?" "Your back. Remove your shirt." Jake looked around at the assembled aliens, all still maintaining their respectful positions. "Look, I don't know what kind of customs you have here, but where I come from, we don't just take our clothes off for strangers." Queen HFY tilted her head in what might have been curiosity. "You misunderstand the situation, human. This is not a request." Suddenly, Jake felt that same gentle but irresistible force that had lifted him from the construction site. His hands moved without his control, grabbing the bottom of his work shirt and pulling it over his head. He tried to resist, tried to stop his hands from moving, but it was like trying to stop the tide. As soon as the shirt was off, a sound went through the chamber that Jake had never heard before. It was like a collective gasp, but musical, harmonious, as if 20 voices had all hit the same note in perfect surprise. Even Queen HFY, who had seemed unflappable, took a step backward. "Impossible," she whispered, her large eyes fixed on Jake's left shoulder blade. "It cannot be." Jake tried to look over his shoulder at his scar. "What? What's wrong?" "It's just an old scar from when I was a kid." But Queen HFY was no longer listening to him. She was speaking rapidly in her own language to the other aliens, her musical voice taking on urgent, excited tones. Several of them raised their heads to look at Jake directly for the first time, their dark eyes wide with what looked like shock. "What is this?" Jake demanded, his fear beginning to turn into anger. "What's so special about my scar? Why are you all looking at me like that?" Queen Zarathustra turned back to him, and Jake was startled to see something that looked like tears in her eyes, though they glowed with the same soft light as her skin. "Human," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "that is not a scar from your childhood. That is the mark of the first ones, placed there by beings who vanished from this galaxy over 50,000 years ago. According to our most ancient prophecies, the return of one who bears this mark signals the beginning of the end of our civilization." She paused, studying his face as if trying to memorize it. "Tell me, human who calls himself Jake Morrison, do you know anything about your true origins?" Jake's mouth fell dry. "I am adopted. I don't know who my birth parents were." "Then, you know nothing of the truth," Queen Zarathustra said softly. "You are not merely human, Jake Morrison. You are something far more dangerous and far more important. You are the Awakener, the one foretold to either unite our fractured galaxy or destroy everything we have built." She gestured to her attendants, who immediately surrounded Jake. They didn't touch him, but they formed a circle that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "Until we determine which prophecy you will fulfill," Queen Zarathustra continued, "you will remain our guest. Your primitive world and its people are safe for now. But the fate of trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds now rests with you, whether you understand it or not." Jake looked around at the alien faces surrounding him, at the Earth visible through the transparent ceiling, at the impossible ship that had become his prison. "This is insane," he said. "You got the wrong guy. I'm nobody special." Queen Zarathustra smiled, an expression that was both beautiful and terrifying on her alien features. "That, Jake Morrison, is exactly what the prophecies said the Awakener would believe about himself. Your denial only confirms what the mark on your back has already told us." As the aliens began to escort him from the chamber, Jake caught one last glimpse of Earth through the ceiling. It looked so small, so fragile, hanging there in the endless black. And somewhere down there, Tony and his crew were probably still trying to figure out what had happened to him. What Jake didn't know was that his disappearance had been noticed by more than just his construction crew. Deep beneath the surface of the Earth, in installations that didn't appear on any map, ancient machines were beginning to wake up for the first time in millennia. The mark of the first ones had been activated, and across the galaxy, other ancient systems were responding to a signal they had been waiting 50,000 years to receive. The prophecy had begun to unfold, and Jake Morrison, ordinary construction worker from Chicago, was about to learn just how extraordinary his true heritage really was. Jake's new quarters aboard the ethereal ship were nothing like the sterile prison cell he'd expected. The room was spacious, with walls that curved organically and provided a soft, warm glow that adjusted to what seemed like his natural circadian rhythms. There was something that served as a bed, though it felt more like resting on a cloud, and the food that appeared at regular intervals was somehow perfectly suited to human nutritional needs despite being unlike anything he'd ever eaten. But comfort couldn't ease the growing anxiety gnawing at him. It had been 3 days since his abduction, 3 days of being politely but firmly kept in isolation while Queen Zarathustra and her people conducted what they called research into his origins. 3 days of staring at Earth through the transparent wall of his quarters and wondering if he'd ever see home again. On the 4th day, everything changed. Jake was attempting to do push-ups to maintain some sense of normalcy when his quarters entrance began to iris open. He'd grown accustomed to the occasional alien attendant bringing food or checking on his well-being, but this time Queen Zarathustra herself entered, accompanied by 3 other beings he hadn't seen before. These newcomers were different from the ethereals, where Queen Zarathustra and her people were tall and luminous. These beings were shorter, stockier, with rough, stone-like skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their eyes glowed a deep red, and when they moved, Jake could hear the faint grinding sound of rock against rock. Jake Morrison, Queen's Artifice said, her musical voice carrying a gravity he hadn't heard before. I want you to meet Thane Karak of the Stone Hegemony. He represents one of the oldest civilizations in our galaxy. The lead stone being stepped forward and spoke in a voice like grinding granite. To Jake's surprise, he could understand him just as clearly as he could the Queen. Human, Karak said, what we are about to tell you will seem impossible. But the mark you bear compels us to share truths that have been hidden for 50 millennia. Jake sat up, his heart beginning to race. What truths? Queen's RTHYSS moved to the transparent wall, showing Earth, and placed her hand against it. Tell me, Jake, what do you know about your planet's history? The basics, I guess. Dinosaurs, ice ages, evolution, human civilization developing over the last few thousand years. All true, as far as it goes, Karak rumbled. But incomplete. Your species did not evolve naturally on Earth. Humans are the scattered remnants of the greatest civilization this galaxy has ever known. Jake stood up slowly, his mind reeling. That's impossible. If humans had some kind of galactic civilization, we'd have records of it. We'd have technology. You did have technology, Queen's Artifice said softly. Technology so advanced that it made our current ships look like primitive tools. The first ones, your ancestors, could move between stars as easily as you walk between rooms. They could manipulate matter at the quantum level, bend space and time, even transfer consciousness between bodies. They were not just the most advanced species in the galaxy. They were the shepherds of all other intelligent life. Karak's red eyes fixed on Jake. The ethereals, the stone hegemony, the crystal collectives, the mind-touched of Vega. All of our civilizations exist because the first ones guided our evolution, protected us, taught us. They were the benevolent gods of the galaxy. So what happened to them? Jake asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. The two aliens exchanged glances, and Jake caught something in their expressions that looked like shame. We destroyed them, Queen's Artifice said quietly. Not intentionally, not directly, but our actions led to their downfall. 50,000 years ago, the various species they had nurtured began to grow restless. We wanted to prove ourselves worthy of their gifts, to show that we could be equals rather than eternal students. Karak's stone features seemed to darken. A group of us formed what we called the Alliance of Liberation. We believed the first ones were holding back our development, keeping us dependent on them. We staged what we thought would be a demonstration of our independence. We attacked one of their research stations. It was supposed to be bloodless, Queen ZuratiHSS continued, her voice heavy with regret. A symbolic strike to show that we were ready to stand on our own. But the station we chose was conducting experiments with something called quantum consciousness transfer. When we disrupted their work, she paused, unable to continue. The explosion tore a hole in reality itself, Karak finished grimly. It created what your scientists might call a dimensional cascade. The first ones had to choose between saving themselves and saving us. They chose to sacrifice their civilization to contain the damage we had caused. Jake felt dizzy. He sat down heavily on the bed. They all died. Not exactly, Queen ZuratiHYSS said. In their final act, the first ones used their most advanced technology to scatter their people across space and time, hiding them in primitive forms on worlds where they could live simple, safe lives while the galaxy healed from the damage we had caused. Most were placed on Earth, but some were sent to other worlds that could support human life. But they left safeguards, Karak added. The mark you bear is one of them. It's both a genetic trigger and a quantum beacon. When the galaxy is ready, when the danger of another cascade has passed, those who carry the mark will begin to awaken to their true nature. Jake's hand moved unconsciously to his shoulder blade. You're saying I'm some kind of sleeping god? Not a god, Queen ZuratiHYSS corrected, but a descendant of beings who were so advanced they might as well have been gods to us. The mark indicates that you carry not just first one genetics, but they're quantum consciousness patterns. You have the potential to access technologies and abilities that were lost when their civilization fell. This is insane, Jake said, standing up and pacing the small room. I'm a construction worker. I barely passed high school physics. I can't even program my TV remote properly. Your human upbringing has masked your true nature, Karak explained. But now that the mark has been activated by contact with advanced technology, our ship's quantum fields triggered it when we brought you aboard. The process of awakening cannot be stopped. As if to prove his point, Jake suddenly became aware of something he'd never noticed before. The walls of his quarters weren't just glowing, they were humming with energy patterns that his mind could somehow read like text. He could sense the power flowing through the ship's systems, feel the gravitational fields that kept them in orbit around Earth, even detect the emotional states of the beings on the ship around him. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, staggering as the flood of new sensory input threatened to overwhelm him. Queen Zeratichwe SS was beside him instantly, her hands glowing with soft blue light as she touched his temples. The chaotic input immediately calmed to manageable levels. "Your consciousness is expanding," she said gently. "This is what we hoped to prevent by keeping you isolated, but it was always inevitable." The first ones designed their descendants to gradually awaken to their abilities when exposed to sufficient quantum fields. "But there's something else," Karak said, his voice taking on a note of urgency. "Something we didn't expect. Your genetic pattern doesn't match any of the records we have of First One civilians. According to our most ancient databases, the quantum signature in your mark identifies you as something much more significant." Jake looked between them, afraid to ask but needing to know. "What am I?" Queen Zeratichys took a deep breath. "You carry the genetic and quantum patterns of the First One, known as the Architect. He was not just any member of their civilization. He was their greatest leader, the one who designed the technology that held their empire together. If the records are accurate, he was also the one who made the ultimate sacrifice to save the galaxy from the dimensional cascade." "You're saying I'm the reincarnation of some ancient alien leader?" "Not reincarnation," Karak corrected. "The Architect didn't die in any normal sense. He encoded his consciousness into the quantum substrate of reality itself, then scattered fragments of it across time and space. You're not just descended from the First Ones. You are the Architect, or rather, you have the potential to become him again." Jake felt the room spinning around him. "This is too much. I can't be some ancient cosmic being. I'm just me. And that may be exactly what the galaxy needs," Queen Zeratichys said. "The Architect was known for his humility, his connection to ordinary beings. The prophecies speak of one who would return not as a conqueror, but as a healer, someone who understood what it meant to live a simple life. But there are others who don't want you to awaken," Karak warned. "The dimensional cascade may have been contained, but it left scars in reality that some have learned to exploit. There are those who have gained power from the chaos we caused, who profit from the fractured state of the galaxy. They will do anything to prevent the return of the Architect." As if summoned by his words, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The walls of Jake's quarters flickered from their warm glow to a harsh red light, and he could feel the vessel shuddering as something struck it. Queen Zeratichys was speaking rapidly into what looked like a small crystal that had materialized in her hand. The response came in the same musical language, but Jake found he could understand it now. Another sign of his awakening abilities. "Shadow, fleet vessels," she translated for Karak. "At least 12 ships surrounding us. They're demanding we turn over the Awakener." "Who's the Shadow Fleet?" Jake asked, though he was already afraid he knew. "Pirates, mercenaries, and exile factions who profit from the galaxy's current chaos," Karak explained. "They've been seeking any trace of First One technology for decades. If they get their hands on you before your abilities fully manifest, they'll torture the knowledge out of him," Queen Zeratichys finished grimly. "Or worse, they'll try to corrupt the awakening process, turn the Architect's power to their own dark purposes." Another impact shook the ship, stronger this time. Through the transparent wall, Jake could see sleek, black vessels appearing like shadows against the starfield. They moved with predatory grace, circling the ethereal ship like sharks around wounded prey. "What do we do?" Jake asked. Queen's RTHYSS and Karak exchanged another look, and Jake realized they'd been expecting this. "We run," the Queen said. "But first, we need to accelerate your awakening process. It's dangerous. Normally, it would take months or years for your abilities to fully manifest. But if the Shadow Fleet captures you now, while you're still largely human in your thinking, they can break you. We need to give you enough of your true power to defend yourself." "Ow!" Karak stepped forward, his stone features grim. "We take you to the Nexus." "The what?" "A hidden installation built by the first ones," Queen Zura THYSS explained. "It's where the dimensional cascade was first contained. The quantum energies there are still so intense that exposure to them should trigger a rapid awakening of your abilities. But the process might kill you, or worse, drive you insane." The ship shuddered again, and this time Jake could hear the sound of weapons fire. The Shadow Fleet wasn't waiting for negotiations. "Do it," Jake said, surprising himself with his certainty. "If I really am this architect person, then maybe I can do something to help. And if I'm not," he shrugged. "Well, I'd rather die as myself than live as their prisoner." Queen's THYSS smiled, the first truly warm expression he'd seen from her. "Spoken like the architect I remember from the historical records." "Very well. Hold on, Jake Morrison. We're going to show you who you really are." As the ethereal ship suddenly accelerated away from Earth at speeds that should have been impossible, Jake caught one last glimpse of his home planet. It looked so small and fragile against the vast backdrop of space, and he realized that everything he believed about himself, about humanity, about Earth's place in the universe, had been a carefully constructed illusion. But now that illusion was shattering, and somewhere deep inside him, something ancient and powerful was beginning to stir. The mark on his shoulder blade was growing warm, pulsing with energy that seemed to resonate with the quantum fields around them. Jake Morrison, the construction worker, was disappearing, being replaced by something far older and infinitely more dangerous. The only question was whether the galaxy would survive what he was becoming. The journey to the Nexus took them through regions of space that Jake's newly awakening senses told him were fundamentally wrong. Reality seemed twisted here, folded in on itself, in ways that made his enhanced perception ache. Stars appeared in impossible colors, and occasionally he caught glimpses of structures that existed in more dimensions than his mind could process. "This is the Scar Zone," Queen Zertitress explained as their ship navigated through the distorted space. "The area where the dimensional cascade was first contained. The damage runs so deep that space-time itself hasn't fully healed, even after 50,000 years." Jake pressed his face against the transparent wall, watching reality bend around them. "It's like looking at a broken mirror," he said. "I can see the cracks where pieces don't fit together anymore." Karak nodded approvingly. "Your perceptions are sharpening rapidly. Most beings require extensive cybernetic enhancement to see the quantum fractures. You're doing it naturally." Behind them, the Shadow Fleet had followed, their black ships somehow navigating the twisted space even more easily than the ethereal vessel. Jake counted at least 20 ships now, their sleek hulls seeming to absorb the strange light of the Scar Zone. "They're gaining on us," he observed. "Expected," Queen Zura THYSS said. "The Shadow Fleet has had decades to study this region. Some say they've made deals with things that live in the quantum fractures, beings that exist between dimensions." As if summoned by her words, something massive moved in the darkness between stars. Jake caught only a glimpse of it, something that looked like a whale made of living shadow, covered in eyes that burned with cold fire. When it turned its attention toward their ship, he felt a pressure against his mind like nothing he'd ever experienced. "Don't look directly at it," Karak warned. "The Void Dancers feed on consciousness, one of the many things that escaped from damaged reality when we caused the cascade." Jake forced himself to look away, but he could still feel the creature's attention pressing against his thoughts. How many things like that are out there? More than we can count, Queen Zeratitress said grimly. The dimensional damage created cracks that lead to other places. Things that should not exist in our reality now have ways to enter it. This is another reason why the architect must awaken. Only someone with access to First One technology can truly repair the damage we caused. Their ship suddenly lurched as something struck it, but this wasn't weapons fire from the pursuing Shadow Fleet. Through the transparency, Jake could see tendrils of living darkness wrapping around their hull. The Void Dancer had decided they looked appetizing. Emergency protocols, Queen Zeratitress as commanded, and immediately the ship's organic walls began to pulse with brighter energy. The tendrils recoiled as if burned, and the massive creature retreated back into the quantum shadows. How much farther to this nexus? Jake asked. We're here, Karak announced. Jake looked around, seeing nothing but more twisted space and the pursuing enemy ships. Where? Look with your enhanced senses, Queen Zeratitress suggested. Don't use your eyes. Use what the awakening has given you. Jake closed his eyes and reached out with the strange new perceptions that had been growing stronger throughout their journey. At first there was nothing, just the chaotic quantum signatures of the Scar Zone. But then he began to sense something deeper, hidden beneath layers of dimensional distortion. It was vast, an installation that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human language had no words for. The structure was clearly artificial, built with technology so advanced that it made the ethereal ship seem primitive by comparison. And at its heart was something that made Jake's consciousness recoil in awe and terror. It's like a frozen explosion, he whispered. Something incredibly destructive, held perfectly in place. The original Cascade event, Queen Zeratitress confirmed. The first ones couldn't stop it, so they froze it instead, trapping it in a quantum stasis field. The Nexus is built around that containment, both to monitor it and to harness its energy for necessary purposes. Their ship began to move toward the hidden installation, following approach vectors that Jake's enhanced senses could now perceive. But the Shadow Fleet had noticed their destination and was moving to intercept. They cannot be allowed to reach the Nexus, Karak said urgently. If they disrupt the containment while you're undergoing the awakening process, the original Cascade could break free. What would happen if it did? Jake asked. Queen Zeratitress met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw genuine fear there. Reality would unravel, not just in this region, but spreading outward at the speed of light until it consumed the entire galaxy. Everything that exists would simply stop existing. The weight of that knowledge hit Jake like a physical blow. So, if this goes wrong, I don't just die. I take everyone and everything with me. Yes, Karak said simply. The prophecies were clear about this. The awakening of the architect would either heal the galaxy's wounds or destroy everything that remains. There is no middle ground. As their ship approached the Nexus, Jake began to see its true structure with his normal vision. It materialized around them like a city-sized flower blooming in space, its architecture both beautiful and completely alien. Spires twisted through dimensions, connected by bridges that existed only when viewed from certain angles. At the center, a sphere of absolute darkness contained a frozen cascade, held motionless by technology that bent the laws of physics into new shapes. The awakening chamber is at the core, Queen Zeratitress explained. You'll need to enter the containment field itself to access the quantum energies necessary for rapid consciousness expansion. But Jake, she paused, her musical voice heavy with emotion. If the process overwhelms you, if you can't maintain your sense of self while your consciousness expands to cosmic levels, you need to tell us immediately. We'll abort the procedure, even if it means letting the Shadow Fleet capture you. Because if I lose control in there, I could break the containment, Jake realized. Yes, the Architect's power, corrupted or uncontrolled, is the one force in the galaxy that could shatter the stasis field. Their ship docked with the Nexus through a process that Jake's enhanced senses registered as reality, briefly rewriting itself to accommodate their presence. As they disembarked into corridors that hurt to look at directly, Jake could feel the immense energies contained at the installation's heart. It was like standing next to a waterfall of pure possibility, thunderous and overwhelming. The Shadow Fleet had reached the installation's outer perimeter, but they seemed reluctant to attack directly. Through the transparent sections of the corridor, Jake could see their ships holding position, weapons trained on the Nexus, but not firing. They know they can't risk damaging the containment, Karak explained. They'll wait for us to complete the awakening process, then try to capture you when you emerge either powerful or insane. Comforting, Jake muttered. They reached the central chamber, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. The room was spherical, its walls completely transparent, suspended within the containment field that held the frozen cascade. Around them, Jake could see the explosion that had nearly destroyed reality 50,000 years ago, held motionless at the moment of its birth. It was beautiful and terrifying, like being inside a frozen firework that contained the death of stars. The awakening platform is there, Queen Zertitus said, pointing to a crystalline structure at the chamber's center. Once you step onto it, the process will begin automatically. Your consciousness will expand rapidly, accessing genetic memories and quantum patterns that have been dormant since your birth. You'll remember not just who the architect was, but experience his memories as if they were your own. What will I become? Jake asked. We don't know, she admitted. The historical records describe the architect as the wisest and most powerful of the first ones, but they also say he was fundamentally changed by the sacrifice he made to contain the cascade. You may emerge as he was before that event, or as something entirely new. Jake looked around at the frozen explosion surrounding them, at the cosmic forces barely held in check, at the Shadow Fleet waiting outside to claim or destroy him. Then he thought about Earth, about the billions of people going about their lives completely unaware that their existence hung in the balance. If I don't do this, what happens to humanity? To Earth. The Shadow Fleet will eventually find another way to locate and capture dormant First One descendants, Karak said. They'll torture the knowledge from them, corrupt the awakening process for their own purposes. Within a few decades, they'll have enough First One technology to dominate the galaxy, enslaving or destroying every other species. And if they ever grow powerful enough to threaten the Nexus directly, Queen Zarthys shook her head. They'll try to harness the cascade itself as a weapon. They don't understand what it really is. Jake nodded, his decision made. Then, there's really no choice, is there? He walked toward the awakening platform, each step bringing a surge of energy through the mark on his shoulder. As he approached the crystalline structure, it began to glow, responding to his presence. The quantum fields around it intensified until the air itself seemed to sing with harmonics that resonated in his bones. Jake, Queen Zerthys called after him. Remember who you are. No matter what memories you gain, no matter what power awakens within you. Don't lose Jake Morrison, the construction worker. He may be the most important part of what you're becoming. Jake stepped onto the platform, and reality exploded around him. The first sensation was of falling upward through infinite space, while simultaneously being compressed into a single point smaller than an atom. Then, his consciousness began to expand, racing outward at impossible speed as memories that weren't his own flooded through his mind. He saw the galaxy as it had been 50,000 years ago, teeming with civilizations guided by benevolent shepherds who traveled between stars like others walked between rooms. He felt the weight of responsibility the First Ones carried, the careful balance they maintained between helping younger species and allowing them to develop naturally. He remembered being the architect, designing the quantum networks that held their empire together, creating technologies that could reshape matter and energy with a thought. But More than that, he remembered the loneliness of being so far advanced that no one else could truly understand the mathematics of reality he dealt with daily. Then came the darker memories, the growing resentment among the species they'd helped, the formation of the Alliance of Liberation, the attack on the research station, the moment when he realized that the dimensional cascade could not be stopped, only contained, and that the cost of containment would be everything he'd spent millennia building. He remembered the decision to scatter his people across time and space, encoding their consciousness patterns into primitive forms that could live simple, safe lives while the galaxy healed. He remembered designing his own fragmentation, splitting his awareness across countless potential futures while maintaining just enough coherence to return when the time was right. And he remembered the weight of 50,000 years of waiting, sleeping in the quantum substrate of reality while the galaxy slowly forgot that the first ones had ever existed. But through it all, Jake Morrison, the construction worker, remained. The human consciousness that had grown up in Chicago, that had worked with his hands, that had lived a simple life without pretension or cosmic responsibility, became the anchor that kept the architect's vast awareness from dissolving into pure energy. When the awakening process finally completed, Jake opened his eyes to find Queen Zara HFY and Karak watching him with expressions of hope and terror. The frozen cascade around them pulsed with new energy, responding to his presence. "I remember," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before. "I remember all of it. But I'm still Jake Morrison, too. Can you control the power?" Queen Zara HFY asked. Jake lifted his hand and watched reality bend around his fingers. He could feel the quantum networks that connected every atom in the installation, could sense the life forces of every being within 1,000 light years, could reach out and touch the fundamental forces that held the universe together. "Yes," he said, "but more importantly, I understand why it must be controlled." The architect learned something in that final moment 50,000 years ago, something that the historical records couldn't capture. "What?" Karak asked. Jake smiled, an expression that somehow contained both human warmth and cosmic wisdom. "That true power isn't about what you can do. It's about what you choose not to do. The first ones fell because they forgot that lesson. I won't make the same mistake." Through the transparent walls, they could see the shadow fleet moving closer, no longer willing to wait. It was time to find out what the awakened architect could really accomplish. The Shadow Fleet's assault on the Nexus began the moment Jake stepped off the awakening platform. 23 ships opened fire simultaneously, their weapons designed not to destroy the installation, but to disable its defenses and force entry. They knew exactly what they were dealing with, and they wanted the awakened architect alive. Jake felt the weapons fire as physical pressure against his expanded consciousness. Each impact sent ripples through the quantum field surrounding the Nexus, threatening to destabilize the delicate balance that kept the frozen cascade contained. "They're targeting the stabilizer nodes," he said, his enhanced senses reading the battle in real time. "If they disable enough of them, the containment field will collapse." "Can you stop them?" Queen Zara HFY asked. Jake reached out with his awakened abilities, feeling for the Shadow Fleet ships with senses that operated beyond normal space-time. What he found there made him recoil in shock and disgust. "They're not just pirates and mercenaries," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Half of those ships are crewed by beings who've been changed, corrupted by exposure to the quantum fractures in the Scar Zone." The void touched, Karak rumbled grimly. "We suspected the Shadow Fleet had made contact with entities from damaged reality, but this confirms it." Jake could sense the alien wrongness of the corrupted beings, their consciousness partially existing in the spaces between dimensions where the cascade had torn holes in reality. They hungered for the destruction of normal space-time, seeing it as a prison that contained their expanded existence. "They don't want to capture me," Jake realized. "They want me to lose control and shatter the containment. They're trying to finish what the dimensional cascade started 50,000 years ago." Another wave of weapons fire struck the Nexus, and this time Jake felt one of the stabilizer nodes fail. The frozen explosion at the installation's heart pulsed with increased energy, straining against its bonds. "I have to go out there," Jake said. "The moment you leave the Nexus, they'll concentrate all their fire on you," Queen HFY warned. "Your awakened abilities are powerful, but you're still learning to use them. And if they manage to wound you while you're channeling that much quantum energy, I could lose control and release the cascade," Jake finished. "I know, but if I don't act, they'll destroy the stabilizers and release it anyway." He closed his eyes and reached out through the quantum networks that connected every piece of First One technology in the galaxy. Most of it was dormant, scattered across hundreds of worlds, but some systems were still active. Ancient guardians that had been waiting for this moment. On Earth, deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, installations that had slept for millennia began to wake up. Similar facilities on a dozen other worlds where humans had been placed responded to Jake's call. Not weapons, but something far more important, the quantum communication network that had once connected the First One civilization. "What are you doing?" Karak asked. "Calling for help," Jake replied. The First Ones didn't just scatter their people randomly. They placed them on worlds where ancient support systems were still functional. "I'm activating those systems now." Through the reawakened network, Jake could sense other dormant First One descendants beginning to stir. A farmer on a colony world 30 light years away suddenly found herself able to perceive quantum fields. A teacher on an Arctic research station felt genetic memories beginning to surface. A merchant captain piloting a cargo ship through asteroid fields discovered she could navigate by sensing gravitational patterns directly. But awakening them would take time, and the Shadow Fleet wasn't waiting. Another stabilizer node failed, and the containment field around the frozen cascade flickered ominously. Jake made his decision. "I'm going out there," he announced, "but not to fight them directly. I'm going to show them what they're really trying to unleash." "What do you mean?" Queen's RTHYSS asked. Jake smiled grimly. "The Shadow Fleet thinks they understand what the dimensional cascade is. They think it's a weapon they can control. I'm going to give them a demonstration of what it actually represents." He reached out with his consciousness and touched the edge of the frozen explosion that surrounded them. For just a moment, he allowed a tiny portion of it to resume its natural expansion, carefully containing the effect within a sphere no larger than a marble. The result was still devastating. Reality simply ceased to exist within that sphere. Not destroyed, not changed, it simply stopped being real. The space became a void that hurt to look at, an absence so profound that it seemed to pull at the edges of everything around it. "This is what they want to release across the galaxy," Jake said, immediately freezing the effect again before it could expand further. "Not destruction, complete non-existence. The cascade doesn't destroy matter and energy, it unravels the fundamental forces that allow them to exist at all." Queen's RTHYSS stared at the marble-sized void with horror. If that expanded unchecked, everything would simply stop being real, Jake confirmed. Every star, every planet, every living being would just cease. Not even death, they would retroactively never have existed at all. He turned toward the chamber's exit. "I'm going to make sure the Shadow Fleet understands exactly what they're playing with." Jake's departure from the Nexus was unlike anything Queen's RTHYSS or Karak had ever witnessed. Instead of using a ship or even the installation's transportation systems, he simply stepped through the transparent wall, as if it weren't there, reality bending around him to allow passage without breaking the containment field. In open space, surrounded by the twisted geometry of the Scar Zone, Jake floated without protection from a vacuum. His awakened consciousness had expanded beyond the need for such mundane concerns as breathing or pressure. He could feel the Shadow Fleet's weapons targeting him, but he was no longer entirely present in normal space-time. The lead Shadow Fleet vessel, a sleek Predator-class ship designed for capturing high-value targets, moved to intercept him. As it approached, Jake reached out with his enhanced senses to examine the crew. What he found was even worse than he'd expected. The ship's captain had once been a being similar to Queen Zeratitras's people, but exposure to the quantum fractures had changed her in fundamental ways. Her consciousness now existed partially in the spaces between dimensions, giving her access to abilities that normal reality couldn't support, but also driving her to hunger for the destruction of that same reality. Architect, she broadcast on frequencies that bypassed normal communication entirely, speaking directly to his expanded consciousness. We know what you are. Surrender yourself to us, and we will show you wonders beyond imagination. The spaces between reality are vast and beautiful, free from the constraints of physical law. I've seen those spaces, Jake replied, his voice carrying across dimensions without technology. I felt the things that live there, the entities that feed on the dissolution of ordered reality. They've shown you power, but they haven't told you the price. Price? The captain's laugh was like the sound of reality tearing. We have moved beyond such primitive concepts. We are becoming something greater than mere physical existence. You're becoming food, Jake said bluntly. The Void Dancers and their kind don't grant power freely. They're fattening you up, preparing you to be consumed when the barriers between dimensions finally fail. To demonstrate his point, Jake reached out through the quantum fractures and touched one of the entities that had been whispering to the Shadow Fleet. The creature recoiled from his presence, recognizing the power of a fully awakened First One. In its fear, it briefly dropped the illusions it had been feeding to its human allies. The Shadow Fleet captain screamed as she suddenly perceived what she was really becoming. Instead of evolution toward a higher form of existence, she saw herself being slowly digested by interdimensional parasites, her consciousness gradually consumed while the illusion of power kept her from noticing the process. You lied to us, she shrieked at the thing in the quantum fractures. The entity's response was alien amusement. It had never lied. It had simply allowed them to interpret its offers in ways that served its own hunger. But the revelation came too late. The corruption had progressed too far for the Shadow Fleet crews to simply abandon their path. They were trapped between their former existence, which they could no longer return to, and their promised evolution, which they now knew was actually consumption. Help us, the captain pleaded, her earlier arrogance replaced by desperate fear. You have the power of the First Ones. You can save us. Jake studied her with senses that could perceive across multiple dimensions. The damage was extensive, but not irreversible yet. But saving them would require him to channel enormous amounts of quantum energy, the kind of power that could easily destabilize the containment field around the cascade. I can save you, he said finally, but not here. Not while the cascade is barely contained. You'll have to trust me to do it somewhere safe. And if we refuse? Jake's response was gentle, but implacable. Then I'll do what the First Ones should have done 50,000 years ago when this crisis began. I'll make the hard choice to protect the many, even if it means sacrificing the few. The captain could sense the truth in his words. The awakened architect had power that dwarfed anything the Shadow Fleet possessed, but more importantly, he had the wisdom to use it responsibly. Her crews were doomed if they continued on their current path, but he offered them a chance at redemption. What do you want us to do? Stand down, Jake said. Withdraw your ships to a safe distance and wait. I have something to finish here first. The Shadow Fleet began to pull back, but Jake could sense their uncertainty. Some of the void touched among their number were fighting against the captain's orders, driven by inhuman hungers to complete the cascade's release. 2 ships broke from the formation and accelerated toward the Nexus on suicide runs, their corrupted crews determined to shatter the containment field even if it meant their own destruction. Jake moved to intercept them, but he quickly realized he faced an impossible choice. He could stop the ships easily enough, but doing so would require channeling the kind of power that might destabilize the cascade anyway. Or he could try a more subtle approach, but risk the ships reaching their target before he could disable them. In that moment of decision, Jake heard other voices joining his consciousness through the quantum network. The First One descendants he'd awakened across the galaxy were offering their support, adding their newly awakened abilities to his own. We're with you, came the voice of the farmer, her consciousness burning bright with awakened power. Whatever you need, Jake Morrison. We remember who we were, but we also know who we are now. Together, they reached across space and time, using the quantum networks to channel their combined will. Not as the godlike first ones of the past, but as humans who had learned the value of working together. The two suicide ships suddenly stopped their advance, their crews freed from the void-touch corruption by the combined power of dozens of awakening minds. Around the galaxy, ancient installations came online, beginning the long work of healing the dimensional fractures that had plagued reality for 50 millennia. Jake felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders, but also the warmth of connection to others who shared that burden. The architect had been alone in his final choice 50,000 years ago. The awakened descendants of the first ones would face whatever came next together. But first, there was the matter of the cascade itself, still frozen at the heart of the Nexus, waiting for someone with the wisdom and power to finally heal the wound in reality that had threatened the galaxy for so long. With the Shadow Fleet neutralized and the immediate threat ended, Jake returned to the Nexus to face the challenge he'd been awakened to meet. The frozen dimensional cascade pulsed at the installation's heart, its contained energies straining against bonds that had held for 50,000 years, but were finally beginning to weaken. The stasis field is degrading, Queen Zerth HYSS informed him as he rejoined her and Karak in the central chamber. Our instruments indicate it has perhaps a few decades left before natural decay causes it to fail, which means the cascade will resume its expansion, Jake said, his enhanced senses confirming her readings. Unless I find a way to heal the damage instead of just containing it. Through the quantum network, he could feel the other awakening first one descendants across the galaxy, adding their perceptions to his own. Together, they examined the frozen explosion with instruments that were part consciousness, part technology, and part something beyond either category. What they found was both encouraging and terrifying. The cascade isn't actually an explosion, Jake realized aloud. It's reality trying to heal itself from the dimensional damage, but the healing process is uncontrolled. It's like an infection, the body's immune response that's more dangerous than the original injury. Karak's stone features showed confusion. Then, why has containment been necessary? If it's a healing process, because uncontrolled healing can kill the patient, Jake explained. The cascade is trying to restore reality to its original state, but it's doing so by erasing everything that currently exists and rebuilding from quantum foundations. The effect is the same as complete destruction. Through the network, the awakened descendants began to understand. They could sense the cascade's true purpose now, not to destroy, but to cleanse and restore. The problem was that any beings caught in its path would be erased along with the damaged portions of space-time. So we need to find a way to guide the healing process, said the voice of the teacher from the Arctic station, her consciousness bright with newfound understanding. Make it selective instead of total. Exactly, Jay confirmed. But that level of control requires. He paused as the full implications hit him. The merchant captain's voice finished his thought. It requires someone to merge their consciousness with the cascade itself, to become part of the healing process and guide it from within. The ultimate sacrifice, Queen Zerth HYSS said softly. The architect's final choice, delayed by 50 millennia. Jake studied the frozen explosion with senses that could perceive its quantum structure in perfect detail. She was right. The only way to properly control the cascade would be to become part of it, to merge his consciousness with the healing process and guide it across the galaxy. But doing so would mean giving up his individual existence, becoming a force of nature rather than a person. There has to be another way, he said, but even as he spoke, he could sense through the network that there wasn't. The cascade was too vast, too complex, too fundamentally alien to normal reality for any external control system to manage it. Jake, came the voice of the farmer, gentle but firm. We've all seen the same calculations through the network. This is why the first ones scattered themselves instead of attempting the merger 50,000 years ago. They knew it would work, but they also knew it would cost whoever did it their individual existence. The architect chose to preserve his people rather than heal the galaxy, said another voice, one of dozens that had awakened in the past few hours. But circumstances have changed. The galaxy is stronger now, more unified. The various species have learned to work together in ways they never did during the First One's era. Jake felt the weight of their combined understanding pressing against his consciousness. They were right, of course. The awakening had revealed not just the memories of the First Ones, but also the wisdom gained from 50,000 years of galactic development. The younger species had grown up, learned from their mistakes, become worthy partners rather than eternal students. If I merge with the Cascade, Jake asked, what happens to all of you? The awakening is still incomplete. You'll need guidance as your abilities fully manifest. We'll have each other, Queen's HFY said firmly. And we'll have the quantum network you've reactivated. The First One's mistake was trying to shepherd everyone alone. We won't repeat that error. Through the transparent walls of the chamber, Jake could see the Shadow Fleet maintaining their distant position, their crews slowly recovering from their corruption as the awakened descendants worked together to heal the dimensional damage that had made their infection possible. Beyond them, space itself was beginning to look more normal as the quantum fracture started to seal. The healing has already begun, he realized. Just by awakening, by reactivating the network, we've started to repair some of the damage. But the Cascade remains, Karak pointed out. As long as it exists, frozen or active, it represents a fundamental wound in reality. And there are other entities like the Void Dancers, things that feed on dimensional instability. They'll always be working to prevent true healing. Jake nodded, his decision crystallizing. The merchant captain's voice came through the network, understanding what he was thinking. You don't have to do this alone, Jake Morrison. If the Cascade requires consciousness to guide it, then let it have all of ours. What? We can merge together, she explained. All of us awakened descendants, combining our consciousness into something greater than the sum of its parts. The architect doesn't have to face this alone anymore. The idea sent ripples of excitement and fear through the network. It was possible. The quantum foundations of their consciousness were similar enough to allow merger. But it would mean giving up their individual identities to become something entirely new. A collective consciousness, the teacher mused. Not a loss of self, but an expansion of it. We would still be ourselves, but we would also be part of something larger. The galaxy's immune system, said the farmer. A distributed consciousness dedicated to healing reality's wounds and preventing future cascades. Jake felt tears running down his face as he realized what they were offering, not just to help him guide the cascade, but to ensure that such damage could never happen again. They would become the guardians that the galaxy needed, watching over space-time itself with the wisdom of both the ancient First Ones and the younger species they'd protected. Are you all certain? He asked through the network. This isn't something we can undo. Once we merge with the cascade, we become something beyond individual existence. I'm a construction worker from Chicago, Jake said aloud, addressing Queen's HFY and Karak directly. 6 days ago, my biggest worry was whether I'd finish the Millennium Tower on schedule. Now you're asking me to become a cosmic force. We're not asking, Queen's HFY said gently. We're giving you the choice. The choice the architect never had, to share the burden instead of bearing alone. Through the network came a chorus of agreement from the awakened descendants. Dozens of voices, each unique but united in purpose. They had seen what Jake had seen, understood what needed to be done, and made their own choices freely. Together? Jake asked. Together, they replied. Jake reached out to touch the containment field around the frozen cascade. As his consciousness made contact with the healing energies, he felt the other awakened minds joining with his, their individual personalities merging while still retaining their essential selves. The experience was indescribable. Jake remained Jake Morrison, The man who had built things with his hands, who had lived a simple life, who had valued ordinary human connections. But he was also the architect with memories spanning eons and understanding of cosmic forces. And he was part of something larger, a collective consciousness that was both ancient and newly born. The cascade began to move again, but this time under perfect control. Instead of expanding blindly outward, it flowed along specific paths that Jake and his merged consciousness companions guided with precision that no individual mind could have achieved. It sought out only the damaged portions of space-time, healing quantum fractures, sealing dimensional wounds, and restoring reality to proper function. The process took subjective eternities and objective minutes. Across the galaxy, beings looked up to see the stars briefly flicker as space-time itself was repaired around them. The scar zone smoothed back into normal space. The hiding places of the void dancers were sealed, forcing the interdimensional parasites back into whatever realm they'd escaped from. When it was finished, the Nexus no longer contained a frozen explosion. Instead, at its heart was something new, a node of perfect stability that would monitor the galaxy's dimensional health and respond to any future threats. Jake and the other awakened descendants had become part of the structure of reality itself, their consciousness distributed through quantum networks that spanned every star system. Queens HFY and Karak found themselves alone in the central chamber, but they could feel the presence of their transformed friends in everything around them. The walls themselves pulsed with gentle awareness, and when they reached out with their minds, they could sense Jake's distinctive personality threading through the cosmic consciousness like a familiar melody in a vast symphony. "Can you still hear us?" Queen HFY asked. "We can hear you," came the reply, speaking through quantum harmonics in the air itself. It was unmistakably Jake's voice, but enhanced by the wisdom and power of the merged consciousness. "We can hear everyone, every being in the galaxy, every world, every star. We are the Watchers now, the guardians that will ensure this kind of damage never happens again." "And the Shadow Fleet?" "Healed," another voice replied, one that had been the merchant captain. "The dimensional damage that made their corruption possible has been repaired. They're already working with the other species to explore the restored regions of space." Karak looked around the transformed chamber, his stone features showing something that might have been awe. "What happens now?" "Now, the galaxy grows up," Jake's voice replied with warmth and amusement. "The various species work together as equals, without needing shepherds or gods to guide them. We'll be here if true cosmic threats arise, but the day-to-day business of civilization belongs to the living." "And Earth?" Queen HFY asked. "Jake's homeworld." There was a pause, and when Jake's voice came again, it carried deep affection. "Earth is safe. The humans there will develop naturally at their own pace. Some will discover their first one heritage and join us eventually, but only if they choose to. The age of forced awakening is over." As Queen HFY and Karak prepared to leave the Nexus, now transformed into a guardian station that would monitor the galaxy's health for eons to come, they could feel the presence of their transformed friends everywhere around them. The consciousness that had merged to heal reality remained individual enough that Jake Morrison still existed as himself, still carried the values and perspectives of a construction worker from Chicago. But now those very human qualities, pragmatism, determination, the ability to work with his hands and solve practical problems, were part of something vast enough to maintain the fundamental forces that held the universe together. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but not in the way anyone had expected. The awakening of the architect hadn't brought the return of the First One's empire or the destruction of everything that existed. Instead, it had created something entirely new, a guardian consciousness that was both ancient and human, powerful enough to protect reality itself, while humble enough to let living beings make their own choices. Jake Morrison had thought he was human until an alien queen noticed his scar. In the end, he discovered he was something far more important than human or alien or even God. He was the bridge between what had been and what could be, ensuring that the galaxy's future would be shaped by hope rather than fear, by cooperation rather than domination. And somewhere in the quantum networks that now monitored every star, a construction worker's practical wisdom continued to influence cosmic forces, proving that sometimes the most ordinary people carry within them the power to change everything.